one of the hardest parts of looking for a job is just well, there's two parts really. There's first of all, figuring out what it is that you really want to do, which is a really hard question to answer. It's one of those chicken or egg things. Until you are in the job, you don't really know what it's like. And that can feel really paralyzing because you feel like you've got to make the perfect choice. And so I think people put a lot of pressure on themselves to make the perfect next move, especially if they aren't feeling very satisfied in their current job, because the last thing you want to do is make the same mistake again. So those types of people are being especially careful about making sure that they don't make the same mistake. So there's that. There's figuring out what to do. There's also just the inevitable process of finding a job that takes longer than you probably have envisioned when you started. I think most people feel like within a few weeks, they're going to find their next job. And even in the back of your head, if you think it's going to take longer, you don't really want it to take longer. So when you go through this period where you're just not getting the traction that you had hoped to get, what tends to happen is you start doubting whether this effort is even worth it. You start doubting whether you are applying to roles that you realistically can get. So maybe you need to rethink your expectations, and maybe you don't want to go for your dream job and you just got to settle for a job that's okay, that's tolerable. And also, I think people just run out of steam. It's hard to apply to jobs. It's hard when you don't hear anything back. It's hard when you go 95% of the way through the interview process, you get to the last round and then you still don't get the job. So that's really frustrating. So I think it's like anything else that involves an inevitable amount of rejection. And those people who can stick with it tend to eventually have a breakthrough.
Yeah. And, even in your story and in the story that my career changes as well, I think one of the interesting things is you don't always make the right move the first time. Right? Like it's directionally correct, but it maybe isn't the end of the line, right? Because I know in your story, you've made multiple career changes, right? Big ones too. Yeah. And I think like, I always love the story in your TED Talk where you talk about, selling the floppy disks as a kid and things like that.
Yeah.
And like, it kind of, when we do start making these moves in the right direction, it kind of brings back memories from other parts of our lives. And I think that that's maybe one of those signs that's really good to look out for, as well as like almost reconnecting with parts of yourself that maybe hadn't been allowed to flourish in the roles that you've had so far. What was that like for you? What were maybe some of those things that you re-engaged with in your own life as you made these different career transitions?
So you mentioned the floppy disks, and just to help listeners maybe understand what in the world that was referencing. So back when I was in high school, I grew up in a town in Missouri called Springfield. Grew up in Springfield, Missouri. At that moment in my life, I was in high school and was in my teenage years, had all intentions to go to medical school. But there was a little side project that I engaged with. I used to love computers and tinkering with computers when I was growing up. My uncle actually gave me my first computer, or gave us our first family's computer, and it was probably the early 90s. It was like a 386 computer. That number is not going to mean anything to most listeners here today, but it like ran on MS-DOS. It was like Windows 3.1. And at the time, people were using floppy disks to transfer media. And so I started this little business in the bottom of our basement at home, where I was just selling and reselling blank floppy disks. So I just buy them in bulk and resell them. And I loved it. I loved the process of coming up with the business idea. It was a simple resale idea, coming up with like the marketing of it, which was basically just promoting it on the predecessor to the internet, which was called bulletin board systems at the time. And yeah, even things like customer service and checking in on clients who bought, probably just out of sympathy, bought discs from me instead of going to a place like Best Buy. And then I kind of just shut that down, both mentally and also practically, I literally shut it down and spent the next few years focused on medical school. And it wasn't until I eventually left medical school behind. I went to the Georgetown School of Medicine. I dropped out after 2 weeks after realizing I was on the wrong path. And then it wasn't until a few years later that I actually went and did my MBA, got involved with entrepreneurship studies there and marketing. And then the rest of my career, I basically focused on business. But you're right, Martin, about us needing to allow ourselves to go and do these things. I was just back at Northwestern. I went to Northwestern University for undergrad. I think you and I were talking about that.
Yeah.
I was just there a couple of weeks ago. I was just back in Evanston, literally 2 weeks ago. And walking around campus, I just realized that I didn't do a lot of the things that you were just alluding to, which was to allow myself to explore there. I just completely shut it down. I was just so singularly focused on achieving one specific career goal. And I think it's so important that having been through that process, it's really important that people try to allow themselves to dabble in those areas that were interesting to them before they felt like they had to go in a certain direction. What are the things that you felt were just naturally engaging to you as a kid? And another example, I used to like to record. Oddly, it's a weird thing for a kid to do, but I at least like recording my voice into a tape recorder that my mom bought. And I would record commercials off the television, and I would record music, and I just loved like recording it and playing it back. It was the weirdest hobby ever. I used to do it in my closet in my bedroom. And then you jump forward a couple decades, and now I'm doing a podcast, and I love doing it. So I do think that there's a lot of clues in our childhood about what we could do that would be fulfilling.
That's so funny that you bring up the tape recorder. I had one of those like little handheld ones, right, with the tiny little tape decks, and I would do the same thing.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and I would record journals in like voice journals, and I have no idea where they are these today. I would love to get my hands on that again. But yeah, as you just triggered that again, it's funny that we both have podcasts at this point. Like
that is funny. It's not a coincidence. I think.
Right.
I think these things are clues. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they really are, because it's kind of taking yourself back to a time when you were allowed to be a little bit more selfish. And I think that's one of the things that like, and not selfish in a bad way, like selfish in that like right now, if you try to make that career change or you say, I want more, like you said, it's like it brings up a lot of doubt and it brings up a lot of guilt to even want that stuff. And I don't think as kids, you're sitting around going like, oh no, I'm being selfish. Like now people will say that. I need to be more selfish. Like, and they like actively try to be more selfish. Right. But as a kid, you're just like, no, I'm just into things. And you just do things because you're bored and you don't have, the weight of the world on you yet. And like,
right.
That is such a big thing. I actually have like a bunch of notes on my desk of things that people say in my coaching sessions. And one of them is be more selfish, next to one that says F you, because that's what the person wanted to say to someone at their job. But I do think that it's kind of interesting to like help people deal with that doubt and that guilt and then reconnect with those natural tendencies